Hi everyone. Well, I wanted to do a video to answer a question that I got in response to my last video, which was about the Communist Party of Russia in the post-Cold War period. But I got a question here from Ramesh Kilawan, and the question here is, even with the collapse of the USSR, one question is how communism built such a powerful union, another superpower, in such a short time from the ashes of a world war, and was threatening the USA. So I like questions like these because I think that they basically touch on a reality that after a conflict is over or a certain historical event tends to happen, we look back on these things with a certain sense of inevitability. But in many ways, the most interesting or equally interesting questions are not only why did these outcomes happen the way they did, why did, for example, certain parties win in a conflict, certain parties lose, but also how did the losing parties kind of survive and thrive for as long as they did. And I think if you think about it, the Soviet Union, in a certain sense, was a spectacular failure in the sense that it obviously collapsed, but it also, as the reader here is indicating, really did have a remarkable run when you look at where the Soviet Union began in the early 1920s, and how much clout it wielded for many decades, and really, I would argue, posed among, if not the most formidable challenge the U.S. has ever faced. So I would answer this question, I would point to three big reasons. So I think the first is that although the Soviet Union was formally constructed in the early 1920s as a communist state, it wasn't starting from scratch. So the Soviet Union really built on a much longer tradition in Russia, basically of generally of being a country, a political entity that really aspired to a great power status in the world. And one manifestation of that was that the Russian state, long before the communists took over, had been engaged in a project or campaign of empire building. This is something, if you look back at the history of the Tsars of Russia, was a very common recurring pattern in Russian statecraft. And so when the communists took over in the early 1920s, they picked up on this theme, a much longer tradition in Russian history, which allowed them to wield a great deal of power, not only in their immediate neighborhood, but also laid the foundation for becoming a global superpower. The second point that I would make here, it ties to the first, which is that the Soviet Union sort of had a tradition, or maybe it's better to say a lack of tradition, of respecting individual liberties. And so when they set up these 5-year plans to modernize the Soviet economy, they could do so really without regard for many of the basic individual rights that would have been a factor, for example, in the Western world, which at that time was constituted the preeminent source of powers in the world. And although this kind of willingness to pursue economic goals ultimately played a part in undermining the Soviet Union, if you look at if you're looking specifically at this question of how did this communist empire become what it did, pose such a formidable challenge, I think one answer to that question is that when you look at these 5-year plans that began under Stalin, admittedly at a high human cost, they did actually achieve quite a bit in terms of recovering from the World War and building a global superpower. So, for example, among other economic indicators, you saw during this period total industrial output seeing triple-digit returns. And then the final point I would argue is that the Soviet Union exercised a great deal of what we might today call soft power. So part of this had to do with the fact that Russian culture had produced things that were broadly recognized around the world. Classical music, for example, being one example. But I would argue that the most important, specifically in the context of the Soviet Union, was how effective they were at amplifying their power through political warfare. And if you look back, especially during this early period of the Cold War, it's quite incredible, actually, that despite many of the problems in the Soviet Union, the gulags, the ethnic cleansing, and so forth, that communism, as manifested in the Soviet Union, really inspired people all over the world. It helped foment communist movements, communist rebellions around the world, including in the Western world. I think one of the chapters of history that I think does not often get enough attention is in Europe, for example, during the Cold War, you had these Euro-communist movements that really had a significant degree of following and representation in European governments that were allied with the U.S. And then even in the U.S., you always had that there were contingents of Americans who were out-and-out communist sympathizers, Soviet sympathizers. But even those who were not, did not go that far, I think in large part as a testament to Soviet political warfare, never quite grappled with or grasped how to really compete with the Soviet Union. And so although the U.S. and its allies, I would argue really for the duration of the Cold War, had a significant economic edge, military edge, political edge, specifically in this realm of propaganda, political warfare, I think you could argue that the Soviet Union did an effective job of accounting for their power disadvantage. And so I think these three ingredients really account for how the Soviet Union became such a powerful force. And if we're thinking, and I think this is an important question, because if we now think about it in the lens of hypotheticals or historical counterfactuals, one has to wonder if the collapse and demise of the Soviet Union was in fact inevitable, or if they had made different decisions, could they have over time corrected for some of their weaknesses and really continued to play a prominent role in the world.